Sometimes a story is just a story, but more often than not, they are a lesson cloaked in entertainment. The stories I share here are definitely the latter. Some are fact, some are fiction, all are beneficial. Hello, my name is Earl Breon, and you are listening to The Leadership Chronicles. Today's story is titled, How One Bully Killed Hundreds of Thousands. Many of us know who Sir Joseph Lister is, even if we don't realize it. If you've ever used Listerine, it was named after him in part due to his groundbreaking work in aseptic and antiseptic medical techniques. If you've ever used a Band-Aid, the Johnson brothers were benefactors of some of Lister's research. In short, and in many people's eyes, Joseph Lister is viewed as the father of modern sterile medicine. But he wasn't actually the first, not by a long shot. Some 20 years before Lister came a man named Ignaz Semmelweis. The problem with Ignaz is that he lacked the social skills of Lister and was a bit of a bully. You see, Ignaz began his work at the Vienna General Hospital in 1846, when he was appointed assistant to the Professor John Klein in the first obstetrical clinic. This clinic was attended to by doctors and was set up to provide services for the poor and the prostitutes in the area. In exchange for providing them with free maternity services, new and upcoming doctors and nurses would get to practice medicine on them. And Vienna General did have a second clinic that was run purely by nurses. So what was the main difference between these two clinics? Well, sadly, it was the mortality rate. Now, in modern medicine, we may be inclined to think that women died more at the hands of nurses than doctors, but back then, you'd be wrong. Now, statistics vary a little bit because record keeping just wasn't as great back then, but the nurses' clinic had a mortality rate for mothers down around 4%. For doctors, again, these numbers range anywhere from 10 to well over 20%, depending on the year and whose records you look at. The point to keep in mind here, though, is that no matter how you look at the data, it was significantly worse in the doctor's clinic versus the nurse's clinic. It was so bad, in fact, that women would try to avoid the first clinic at all costs. Some of these women even chose to deliver on the streets rather than be admitted to it. The second clinic, however, they kept their mortality rates much lower, even during periods of other medical epidemics that caused the first clinic's numbers to spike. So, what was killing these women? It was something called puerperal fever or childbed fever. This essentially was a form of sepsis that predominantly women suffered during childbirth, and it was Ignaz's sworn enemy. The disparity between these two clinics drove him mad as he looked for a solution to close the gap. He tried many different things. For instance, there was a custom of a priest ringing a bell down the hallway when someone died. He put a stop to this practice, thinking that hearing the bell signifying a death put the woman in a higher stress level, and that subsequently led to her dying. And it was this constant bell ringing that compounded on one another to lead to more and more deaths in the doctor's ward. A colleague had theorized that it was simply due to overcrowding of patients, but Ignaz was able to go through the data and quickly realize that, in fact, the nurse's clinic was more overcrowded on a regular basis than the doctor's clinic. So, what was going on? How could the second clinic of nurses maintain lower, consistent numbers? Ignaz went through all sorts of these types of experiments, but none of them really paid off. It wasn't until tragically in 1847 when a friend of Ignaz's, Jakob Kolechka, was accidentally cut by another student during a post-mortem examination. Jakob died a few days later of what Semmelweis said looked to be childbed fever. Ignaz took on Jakob's autopsy, and the pathology presented itself to be in line with what Ignaz knew childbed fever looked like. But one thing was obvious. Jakob did not give birth. How could this happen? Well, then Ignaz remembered reading in the report about the cut, and he asked himself, could some form of cadaverous material be spreading this infection? Is this what killed his friend and what was killing the women? It made sense because the nurses never worked on cadavers and their mortality rate was so low. If this was the case, how could I stop it? Well, the solution, pun intended, was chlorinated lime. Ignaz chose this solution because it was what they used to get rid of the smell of rotting flesh in the morgue. So, he surmised that it may be removing whatever this unseen cadaverous poisonous material was. Keep in mind, microscopes hadn't been invented yet and germ theory had not been put forward. So, whatever was going on was unseen and was really a groundbreaking guess by Ignaz. But, being a passionate scientist, Ignaz put all that aside and began doing experiments where he required doctors to wash their hands with this chlorinated lime solution. Lo and behold, mortality rates plummeted. Within a year of the practice, the first clinic had its first series of consecutive months with 0 deaths, and their mortality rate was in line with, and in some months lower than, the second clinic of nurses. So this is all starting to sound pretty good, right? But the problem is, Ignaz was a bully. He never took the time to generate any type of buy-in with the doctors. He just demanded it. And he didn't care that due to societal norms at the time, a bloody doctor was seen as a good doctor because they were practicing. Therefore, they knew what they were doing. Clean doctors were seen as not practicing, and they weren't held in the same regard. So all of the doctors seen him asking them to be clean as putting forward a message that they were not as good of doctors. The other thing, again, keep in mind, Ignaz had no physical proof other than numbers. And in the medical community, these numbers were easily dismissed as being coincidental. Now, at each of these junctures, Ignaz failed to exert any type of influence. He didn't use any type of soft skills to get people on board. He simply relied on his power as the second in command of this obstetrical clinic to bully people to wash their hands. He demanded it. If you want to work here, you will wash your hands. And he even took it to the streets. He went as far as a campaign walking down the streets when he would see a woman pregnant, telling her that if her doctor didn't wash their hands, that they were intentionally trying to murder her, and urged the patients to not see them. Now, we know that these things were true, but again, it went against societal norms, and obviously this did not set well with the medical community at large. It went so poorly for Ignaz that he was eventually fired from Vienna General. His practices of hand washing were discontinued, and mortality rates shot up again to where they were before. This compounded on Ignaz's drive and emotional state, and it literally drove him mad. He started writing a book that was eventually published to put his research forth, but the vast majority of the book was spent belittling the medical community and calling them murderers and talking about how they were intentionally trying to kill their patients. It went so far that Ignaz was eventually deemed crazy and institutionalized. And the truth is, he actually probably did lose his mind because he knew he had a solution, but he didn't have the skill set or the technology to prove it out and generate buy-in. So he just kept getting angrier and angrier and becoming more and more of a bully and more venomous with his rhetoric towards the medical community. So the irony of this story is that while he was institutionalized, Ignaz actually tried to escape. During the escape, he was badly beaten and needed stitches. When the attending physician came in to sew him up, Ignaz noticed that his hands were dirty. He went into a fit and begged the attending physician to wash his hands before applying the sutures. Now, given his reputation and his status as a bully and being seen as a little daft, the physician ignored him and sewed him up, bloody hands and all. Ignace died shortly after from blood poisoning, the very thing that he was fighting to try to eliminate. Now, 20 years later, building largely on some of Ignace's work, coupled with the advancements of germ theory and the ability to influence others that he possessed, Joseph Lister put forth many of the same solutions as Ignace. This time they were embraced. Yeah, it still took him a fair bit of convincing because the medical community wasn't ready to ditch their dirty clothes, but medicine was changed forever because of Lister's abilities to build influence and build teams. Now, it's estimated that in that 20-year gap between Ignace Semmelweis and Joseph Lister, that easily hundreds of thousands of women across Europe died from childbed fever. Just imagine if Ignace had only had Lister's people skills. Now, some growth questions for you. Do you have the soft skills needed to generate and maintain buy-in, or do you rely on your positional power to demand things from your team? What is your childbed fever? What is the one problem that keeps you up at night trying to solve? What piece of information, technology, or person is missing to help you solve it? And when you finally do, how will you implement the solution? Will you hoard all the glory and tell the doubters off? Or will you team build and bring others on board to make the solution even stronger? One path can change the world forever, and another can leave you an almost forgotten footnote in history. Choose wisely. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Leadership Chronicles. To continue the discussion, find me on Twitter at Earl_Breon or email me at podcast@earlbreon.com.